All right, there, econ friends, welcome back. So in previous monopoly videos, we've introduced and defined monopoly. We've understood the barriers to entry. We then took a dive to explore how monopolies set and determine their Q and their P. In other words, their profit maximizing behavior. We learned that process where we take MR equal to MC and drop that line down for the quantity, then take it up and over for price, and up to the ATC and over for ATC, and then you compare your boxes. So you know what monopoly is, its traits, its definition, its profit maximizing behavior. And in our last video, we explored the idea of the monopoly versus perfect competition when it came to efficiency and social welfare. And we learned that in the three big tests that we have, right? The total surplus test, the allocated efficiency test, and the productive efficiency test, the monopoly fails. It's 0 for 3. In this video, we're going to ask a couple of questions about knowing that monopoly is inefficient. What options do we have at the policy level to counter some of those bad effects of monopoly? Okay, let's jump in. So again, we know that monopolies pose some problems with respect to their overall economic efficiency and that their market power can cause some issues. So with that, we know that the public, specifically through their governments, through their lawmakers, the public must decide on how to deal with monopoly. Generally speaking, there's two major approaches, okay, two broad conceptual buckets with which we can deal with monopoly. Number one, we can break up the monopoly with what are known as antitrust policies. Or number two, we can go in and regulate the price that the monopoly can charge, okay? So the two major approaches to monopoly would include breaking them up with antitrust policies. Note that on top of breaking up monopolies, antitrust laws can also prevent mergers from happening. So they can also prevent monopoly. And number two, regulating the price that the monopoly can charge. Let's jump in really quickly and discuss antitrust laws. So antitrust laws refer to a body of legislation, a type of law that is designed to limit any behavior that substantially lessens competition, okay? So antitrust laws are laws that are designed to promote competition or to limit any behavior that reduces competition. There's been a couple of major acts in American economic and legal history which have really paved the way for antitrust. The first really important law that was the first antitrust law was known as the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. The Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. Okay, this prohibited what was called restraint of trade as well as price fixing. That restraint of trade provision is really important because what the Sherman Act basically said was any policy, any practice that stifles trade, prohibits trade, places restraints on free trade is illegal. So that was a really broad approach to stifling monopoly power and opening up competitive pressures, okay? A later act was known as the Clayton Act of 1914. The Clayton Act took a few practices, including price discrimination, which we'll discuss later, this thing called exclusive dealings, and what are known as tying sales. It took these and other practices and it made them illegal. But critical to understand, the Clayton Act did not make these activities illegal per se. They were not made illegal like uniformly and blanket all over. Instead, the Clayton Act had some nuance, and it said that these activities and others were illegal, but only if they substantially reduced competition. So it really wasn't the activity that was the focus, it was the impact of the activity. The Clayton Act also prohibited mergers which is when a couple of smaller firms join together or buy each other out or merge to form a bigger firm, typically with a lot more market power, right? A lot more monopolistic power. The Clayton Act prohibited those mergers if they led to weakened competition. Again, the act of merger, not necessarily illegal. It's the impact that really mattered. Today in America, the task of enforcing antitrust legislation, so of enforcing the legislation, of determining when to go to court, and of prosecuting antitrust violations, it falls on a few federal departments, but primarily on the big two: the Department of Justice, known as the DOJ, and what's called the Federal Trade Commission, known as the FTC. Okay, so there's a lot of agencies that cooperate, but the DOJ, the Department of Justice, and the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, those are the two real big federal agencies that handle antitrust for our country. Okay. A final note that I wanted to bring up when it came to antitrust laws: it's very important that you, as an economic thinker, as an economic citizen, as a voter, as a future business community leader, that you understand that, like any economic phenomena, antitrust laws can be good, but like any phenomena, these laws have costs as well as benefits. And it's very important that when you hear about antitrust in the media, or you hear about, laws that are going through, or cases where companies are being broken up or sued, it's very important that you approach it through the lens of economic analysis, that you take a look at the issue at hand, and that you say, well, yeah, monopoly has some issues for sure. They're inefficient, they can abuse market power, but you need to understand that the laws that are in place, like any law, they're going to have cost as well as benefit. And it's your job as an economic citizen, as a thinking citizen, to ask, what are the costs and benefits of this law? And what are the costs and benefits of enforcing this law? That's how you make smart, wise decisions in what is fundamentally a really, really messy area of the economy. Okay, so that's antitrust law. The second big type of government activity is known as government regulation. Okay, government regulation is oftentimes used when we're dealing with natural monopoly. You'll recall, here's a graph for you here. You'll recall that a natural monopoly, also known as an economy of scale, right? The economies of scale. The natural monopoly, it's characterized by I'm going to go to black for some color contrast. It's characterized by a downward sloping ATC curve throughout the relevant range of an economy's production and consumption. Okay, and what this means, as you know, is economy of scale means that as more quantity is produced, the overall average total cost falls as the firm moves from higher places to lower places on the ATC curve. What does this mean? Well, recall that what this means is that monopolies can emerge, but critically, with natural monopoly, a single large firm will typically have a lower ATC, a lower average total cost, than if you had a situation where you had a lot of smaller firms. Okay, so it's really important to bear in mind, when you have natural monopoly, when you have economy of scale, one firm, the monopoly, is typically going to have overall lower costs and therefore potentially lower prices than if you had a situation where many firms were competing. Because obviously, if you have smaller firms, each firm is selling less stuff, which is moving them up the ATC, which is going to raise their cost of production, which could lead to higher prices. So clearly, to go back to the big thing here, the government is going to oftentimes be reluctant to break up a natural monopoly. Because if you break up a natural monopoly and you get 3 or 4 or 5 smaller firms, consumers may not benefit at all because the overall cost will go up and prices can go up. So the government says, well, hell, if we can't break them up, what can we do? And the answer is this second form of monopoly, the tool, and that's antitrust. Sorry, pardon me, that's government regulation, okay? When you have regulation, fundamentally, the government steps in and tells the monopoly, hey, listen, you are not allowed to charge any price you want. In other words, under this second approach, regulation, the government tells the monopoly, you cannot be a pure price maker. You no longer have that ability. And instead, the government steps in and they seek to regulate, basically set the price that the natural monopoly can charge. Okay. Now you can see a lot of issues here already. You know that monopoly is iffy and has some issues, but you also know that these regulations are going to have some cost as well. Okay. That's also going to lead to a fundamental question. If the government says to the monopoly, you cannot charge whatever price you want, you can no longer be a price maker, we're going to regulate your price, this leads to a very critical question. What price will the government allow the monopoly to charge? And who determines that price? And how is that price set? And how is that implemented? Okay, this is a really, really difficult question. It's easy in a lecture. In the real world, it's very, very hard. The idea behind it is also complicated by the fact that implementation of these regulations, as you can predict, will have cost as well as benefits. Okay, so this is not a perfect solution. There is no perfect solution. It's filled with trade-offs, but you have to know the mechanics of it. Generally, if the government is not going to break up a monopoly and they're going to focus on regulation, there's 3 basic ways that the government can go. Number 1 would basically be a do-nothing approach, in which the government allows the natural monopoly to maximize profits as it normally would by setting MR equal to MC, and you know the rest. Okay, that's a do-nothing approach. The second approach would be where the government tells the monopoly that they have to charge a price that is equal to ATC. Note that in this situation, the natural monopoly will achieve 0 economic profit, aka normal profit. And the third approach would be for the government to tell the natural monopoly that they have to set price equal to marginal cost. Notice something important, my friends. These last 2 approaches are basically attempts by the government to mimic perfect competition. Remember from our PC lectures that in the long run, PC firms settle at a price equal to ATC, and they make no positive profits. They make normal profit. So when the government says, hey, we're going to set P equal to ATC, the government is telling the natural monopoly, we're going to mimic one of the conditions of PC. And notice also here, we know that at long run equilibrium, the competitive firm, they're going to settle on a place where price equals marginal cost. That was one of our efficiency metrics. So the government sometimes says to the monopoly, we're going to mimic this condition. You have to charge P equal to MC. So notice again that these last 2 conditions, they're basically ways for the government to force the natural monopoly to mimic some of the conditions that emerge in the PC structure. Okay. I have it right here for you in a summarized chart. I'll also show you this chart at the end of this session so you can see it again. But notice that we basically have profit maximization with price regulation. Just to be clear, you can see that we have the downward sloping demand curve and the MR curve underneath it. Let's get rid of that. You can also see that we have the downward sloping ATC curve. We have the marginal cost curve. Okay, you notice that right here, this would be the minimum efficient scale. That's that point, that quantity level, that output level that minimizes ATC. And notice critically that right here, this represents the extent of the economy's demand. So notice critically that the minimum efficient scale is in excess of the market's overall demand. This implies that there's going to be economies of scale throughout the entire range of consumption and production. Okay, let's take a look at our 3 different ways to do it briefly. Number 1, unregulated. We see that they're just going to simply set MR equal to MC. MC is here, MR is here. They meet right there. We're going to drop a line down, and this is going to be our quantity. We're going to take it up and over, and this will be our price. Nothing new. Straight monopoly, profit maximization. Okay? So that's one way that they can do it. And we'll discuss these in some detail in a bit. I want to give you the terminology and some of the pros and cons. Notice the second approach, average total cost pricing, setting P equal to ATC to have 0 economic profit. Since the price comes from the demand curve, in this second case, you simply go to where the demand curve, which is the blue line here, hits the ATC curve. And that's this point right there. You drop a line down, and this would be your quantity. You drop a line across. That's your price. Notice that in this setup, in this second approach, we've gained some efficiency for sure. We have lower prices. We have higher output. We're going to kill some of that dead weight loss and be a bit more efficient. So that's not bad. There's some trade-offs, which we'll discuss, but that's another way to approach the regulation. And the third approach would be the marginal cost pricing. This is approach number 3, where P equals MC. Again, since the price comes from the demand curve, here we set the demand curve equal to the marginal cost curve, and that's right here. You drop a line down and you get Q. You drop a line across and you get P. And notice here we have even more benefit because the price is even lower and the output is even higher. So we've gotten even more efficient. So those are our 3 main approaches. With that said, let's discuss them in a little bit of detail and figure out the pros and cons of each. So approach number 1, again, the government can simply allow the natural monopoly to maximize profits without any regulation. They're going to do the old MR equals MC rule to get P and Q, and there you go. The second approach, we've already gone over, I just want to spell it out now. The second approach is that the government can force the monopoly to practice allocative efficiency to mimic one of those PC characteristics, practice allocative efficiency by setting the monopolist's price equal to its marginal cost. In other words, P equals MC. Okay, we call this marginal cost pricing. It sounds great, but there's one big problem. Let's go back up here and let's figure out what that problem is. Let's clean this up a little bit. Let's use red for some contrast. If we do marginal cost pricing, we're going to set P equal to marginal cost, which is here. This is going to be our Q. We're going to go across, and this will be our P. So far, so good. But there's a built-in problem. Remember, my friends, that profit is equal to Q times P minus ATC. Well, look at what happens when you engage in marginal cost pricing. The price is right here, but if you extend the Q line up and you hit the ATC curve and you go over, you're going to realize, uh-oh, ATC is actually higher than price. And in fact, if the government forces marginal cost pricing, we're going to have a loss box. That's not good, and it's not sustainable. So we see that if we practice marginal cost pricing, that's option number 2, the firm cannot operate profitably. The firm will face losses. The firm will want to exit the industry. But remember, just because it's a monopoly does not mean that the product that it's producing is bad. The product may be socially desirable. People may want it, but the monopoly is not going to provide it at a loss. And therefore, this leads to a situation where if you have marginal cost pricing, the government likely has to step in and subsidize the monopoly. The government will have to give the monopoly subsidies to help it break even. But this is not a good solution because all subsidies ultimately fall on taxpayers. So even though the consumers might be getting this lower price, they're really still having to pay for it indirectly through higher taxes to offset the subsidy. And also, you know from earlier lectures that subsidies and taxes, they have their own problems and their own dead weight loss. So option number 2, viable, but a lot of holes in that argument and a lot of potential cost. The third option, the government can limit the monopoly's profits to normal profit by setting the monopoly's price equal to its average total cost. Okay. So we're going to set P equal to ATC. This is known in the jargon as average cost pricing. It's also known as rate of return regulation. And it's called rate of return regulation because the price or the rate that the government sets is sufficient to give the firm a normal return, aka normal profit, aka zero economic profit. Okay, so yeah, these policies, they're going to result in zero economic profit, aka normal profit. This is not bad. The monopoly will still get by. They'll be able to, achieve a fair rate of return by covering both their implicit and explicit costs. So this is a pretty good setup, but there's one big flaw. Think about the power of incentive. If the government says to the monopoly, we're going to let you charge a price that's on par with your costs, there is little incentive for the monopoly. There is little incentive for the regulated firm to want to reduce costs. In fact, usually what happens when the government tells a firm, we're going to set your price equal to your cost to have fair rate of return pricing, the firm responds predictably by inflating their costs. They pay their workers bigger salaries. They do lots of really inefficient spending because they figure, what the hell? We're going to be able to charge a price to match our cost anyway. So they have an incentive to not reduce costs, but to blow their costs up. And that's what happens. So there's a weird incentive problem there. In addition, it's really difficult for the government to correctly determine a firm's cost structures. So even though it works out well with a simple graph, with a simple chart, in the real world, it's really not that easy. It's a lot more difficult, okay? So those are our 3 options. We see them again here. Option number 1, a do-nothing approach, but that's going to lead to a lot of inefficiency, those really high prices and low output and big dead weight loss. Option number 2, average cost pricing, which will lead to a bit more efficiency, but is going to have a really bad incentive, a flawed incentive to be inefficient and blow up your cost structure. And in the end, consumers have to pay for that inefficiency because they're paying the prices. And the third one, marginal cost pricing, which is the best way to really lower the cost and expand output and shred out that dead weight loss. But we know that that's going to have another built-in problem. It's going to require a subsidy. In the end, my friends, what I want you to take away from this is that there's no perfect answer. Regulation, it's tough, it's messy. It's hard to get correct data. It's hard to interpret it correctly. It's hard to set an appropriate price. And even when you do it, there's trade-offs. So I offer to you that there are two ways, antitrust law and regulation, in which to address the monopoly issue. But all of those methods that we've discussed, they all have some pros and some cons. In other words, if you're looking for a simple fix, or if you hear a politician or a policymaker offering you a simple fix, be on guard, because these are messy. There is finally one additional way. Sometimes, if antitrust doesn't work and if regulation doesn't work, the government will move to try to run the monopoly itself. Think about the US Postal Service, right? Think about the DMV. These are cases where the government says, we're simply going to provide this service ourselves. So this is another option, a last resort at times, where if antitrust fails and regulation fails, the government runs the monopoly. However, this is probably the worst of all cases, because think about that. The government has no profit motive. They have no profit incentives. And in fact, economists believe that almost inevitably, when the government steps in to do what's called government ownership or to run the monopoly, it's going to lead to massive inefficiency and excessively high production costs and an all-around drop in consumer satisfaction. So, my friends, that's our wrap-up. At the end, we know that monopolies are inefficient, and therefore we had to make some moves to address that inefficiency, but there's no perfect solution. I want you guys as economic students to be aware of the options that we have to address the monopoly issue, but I also want you to be aware as prudent economic thinkers and as informed citizens that they all have trade-offs, okay? Thanks for your time, and I'll see you next time.